What a joy it is indeed to be here to celebrate the two anniversaries, both of the department, 150 years, remarkable record of the Greek and Roman department, and of course the 125 years of the British School. Now, to start, Knossos and the civilization of which it was a, and at times the chief embodiment, is one of the great glories of human achievement. My task, and indeed pleasure today, is straightforward: to set the scene, to summarize by what steps and through what researchers and their researches we have arrived at the present point of exploration, study and knowledge. That present point you will hear all about in the period-specific papers which follow this one. One question we perhaps need to keep in mind constantly, there may even be questions about it, as I gather that afterwards questions are permitted, not from the experts, they're ruled out, good, but from the rest of you who are here. One question is, why did the many, many excavations and field studies and surface explorations take place? In modern parlance, what were the research and other reasons and objectives for work? Now, I've pressed the button which said next. I hope I have. There we are. We're concerned with a period of about 8,000 years, from the first human arrivals around 7000 BC through to the early Byzantine and Arab period, ending towards 1000 AD, 961 AD to be precise, with the Byzantine reconquest of Crete. Of course, the chronology of the investigations does not coincide with the chronology of the historical stages. For example, fine studies of the Neolithic are being carried out right now, as you will hear about from Peter Tompkins a little later. But I will proceed by the chronology of discovery, the building up of the different parts of the picture to its present form. It gets richer each year and will certainly continue to do so. Now, on the previous slide, you may have noticed that 111 had been crossed out and 134 had been substituted. It was pointed out to me over dinner last night that for 134 it should be 133, but never mind. The change of title will come about very clearly because from the next picture, I hope, I got this, oh, there we are, from the next picture. This is Minos Kalokerinos, who in 1878 and 1879 carried out quite extensive diggings intermittently in those years, but with up to 20 workmen in what came to be the west and south wings of the Palace of Minos. Here is Kalokerinos older on the right and with his family on the right-hand part of the other picture. Now, an excellent contribution to understanding Kalokerinos' achievement came from Professor Katerina Kopacka, who has published several papers on the subject. Kalokerinos, in fact, owned a great deal of land at Knossos, and he was a merchant, but with a strong antiquarian interest. And especially he was interested in the Knossian references in Homer and Herodotus and Strabo. So he said, I quote, translating, "I have a great interest in uncovering the prehistoric civilization of Crete." It's interesting to reflect that those were his words in 1878, 1879. He actually wrote down those words some years afterwards, but we needn't doubt that those were his intentions at the time that he went to work at Knossos. And in truth, that has remained really the central aim of most of the people who've worked at Knossos, and indeed wider in Crete, ever since. But it's interesting that he understood it, and that's why he set it out as his aim right at the beginning. Now, Kalokerinos, most of his collection of about 365 items from his work there was destroyed in the calamities which hit the town of Heraklion in particular, on the 25th of August in 1898, the time when, of course, Crete was ending its long domination of Ottoman rule and was moving on the stage towards independence and union with Greece. But not quite everything was destroyed. Oh, here's interesting, actually. Here is a plan of Kalokerinos's work at the palace, what came to be the palace. And it's quite interesting, actually, isn't it, to see that. You can recognize what he saw as a great courtyard and some constructions apparently inside that courtyard, but in fact those are the area of the magazines which the Western magazines which we're so familiar with in the excavations of the palace, and various things which he added around the side. This plan was published later, but it does represent his work at the time. And you see he got the directions right, with north on the right-hand side here, so the magazines are correctly placed, although incorrectly put as if they were inside the courtyard. Now, I say not quite everything was lost. Here is an object which we'll become very familiar with by the end of our study day today. In fact, I'm sure if you walk through the Greek and Roman gallery, you can see it there, because Kalokerinos made a gift of some of these great store jars which he excavated to various museums, including to the Louvre, and fortunately one to us here at the BM. And this is this magnificent pithos from the West Wing. There's a very nice detail that it was not just given by him, but it was transported to Britain in 1884 by the Royal Navy. And it's extraordinary that the ship it came on was HMS Minotaur. Now, moving forward from Kalokerinos, Arthur John Evans, born in 1851, first went to Crete in 1894, and then conducted several explorations through survey work in different parts of the island. He was always very keen to excavate on the Kefala Hill at Knossos. I thank Steve Townsend, who's here for this slide. I think, Steve, this was about 1970 when it was taken. My first picture was one of my own in 1964, so you'll see how Knossos, the area of Knossos looked different then. And Evans began, as is well known, on the 23rd of March in 1900, when he was aged 48. And this is what he was to uncover over some 3 decades of work. He engaged the experienced Duncan Mackenzie as we would say nowadays, his field director, Duncan Mackenzie, on the right, and the very young architect, Theodore Fife, then aged only 25, to be the architect of the excavations. And this was really an excellent team of talents, these 3 people, combining all their different skills, supported, of course, by the Greek foreman, and, interestingly, the workforce which Evans deliberately combined Christian and Muslim workmen to work together in the palace excavations. In my mind, there's no doubt he should be given great credit for that. It was part of his wider vision, his broad liberal vision of how he saw Crete and how its many horrors of the preceding years could begin to be healed, and so he combined his workforce deliberately on that basis. David Hogarth, who was director of the British School at the time, aged 38, advised Evans on archaeological work and conducted his own trial trenches all over the Cnossian hillside. Evans was an Oxford graduate in history, and he had a great knowledge of the ancient past and indeed of European prehistory. A very interesting paper just very recently published by Debbie Harlan, examining Evans's intellectual background in the evolutionary ideas of Tyler and Lubbock at the time, and the connection of that to the use of sacred caves and sacred stones. It does a great deal to explain the context in which some of Evans's early work at Knossos and elsewhere was conducted. Evans had a brilliant mind, and he was able in that stage to encompass most of what could be known about the early civilizations of Crete and the Eastern Mediterranean. His reasons for digging, he'd been preparing for years for this work in the study and on the ground, were really the same as those of Kalokerinos a little earlier, as we've seen, but with some important additions. Evans had a long-standing interest in the origins of writing, and his view that he might well find important evidence at Knossos. It was always important to Evans to present carefully and accurately based reconstruction of his work, reconstitution he called it, so that the world could better understand ancient Knossian achievement. Hence his architect for these reconstitutions on the site created a large number and, of course, in a series of famous illustrations. From the start, he engaged the Swiss father and son, Gilles Héron, père et fils, to carry out these reconstructions and restorations there. But after them, he also engaged a remarkable architect and draftsman, a Yorkshireman called Piet de Jong, his name because of ultimate Huguenot origins in his family, who was born in 1887. Pete died in 1967, and I first met him in 1958, and others here will have known him too. But Pete is responsible for a lot of the reconstruction illustrations that we see. Here, for example, is his well-known painting of how he saw the west wing of the palace, looking at it from the central courtyard. And we needn't suppose for 1 minute that this is some kind of fantasy, as books tend to claim nowadays. All Evans and Fife and Doll and de Jong's work was based on extremely careful observation of what survived at ground level and for some metre or so, a couple of metres so, in the remains, and where staircases went and where columns were and so on. Piet de Jong also carried out, if you go to, whenever one can, we hope very soon, back into the Heraclean Museum, there's a series of lovely paintings on the walls of the museum of this and other reconstruction paintings by de Jong. It's interesting to record that the museum didn't have much money in those days, in the 50s and 60s, and Pete did all that work for a workman's wage, an ordinary labourer's day rate for carrying out that work for the then director, Nicholas Platon, at the museum. Here is a picture of Pete, as you see, as a younger man, about the time he was working there. And one of the other things he did as a sort of sideline, because he had a sort of Yorkshire sense of humour, was to carry out, to construct a series of caricatures of all the archaeological personalities of the day. And this is his remarkable painting of Arthur Evans with the blue monkey fresco behind, correctly blue monkey. Evans at first thought it was a blue boy, but then it was soon realised that this was a fresco with monkeys. And here is Evans delicately probing the Minoan past with its wonderful background in the natural beauties of the island of Crete, Pete's caricature of him. These, by the way, were gifted to the Ashmolean Museum by Sinclair Hood. Now, Evans had excavated large Minoan cemeteries north of Knossos, and there are many others on the eastern slope, the Ilias Hill of the site, opposite the palace. And in 1926, he invited a man called John Forsdyke, who was then aged 43, to excavate one of those cemeteries at a spot called Mavrospilio, Black Cave, on the eastern side of the hill at Knossos. Here is Forsdyke. Thought perhaps appropriate to show a picture of him, because he subsequently he was one of Leslie's predecessors, but then he rose to even higher level, if that's possible, by becoming director of the museum. And he insisted, the only director, I gather, to insist that his portrait should be done in full court dress. So here is Sir John Forsdyke, but we think of him as the excavator of Mavrospilio at Knossos, which was quite promptly published in 1927-28. At the same time, a young Cambridge archaeologist was also brought in by Evans, brought into the Knossian scene in 1928 to replace Duncan Mackenzie, who retired for various reasons by then. And this young Cambridge graduate was the 24-year-old John Pendlebury, a brilliant scholar studying the Bronze Age connections of Crete and Egypt at the time. A brilliant scholar, and also possessed of a full measure of arrogance, perhaps appropriate in a way to someone starting off in those roads at that time. He also excavated at Knossos those very deep pits in the western courtyard of the palace, the so-called couloirs, and the important early houses underneath them. And later, he was to be the field director of Evans's final operation at Knossos in 1931, the so-called Temple Tomb, the so-called Royal Tomb, along the road about half a mile to the south of the palace. But John Pendlebury, of course, became ancient Crete's finest explorer, covering almost every inch of the island. And alongside this, he was a brilliant director of the Egypt Exploration Society's Excavations at Tel El Amarna, revealing and publishing in 3 volumes the buildings of the northern suburb. We saw a very interesting film of that in the Institute of Classical Studies, given by a colleague from the EES recently, a film that was made of Pendlebury's work in Egypt, and very important it was too. In Crete, of course, he's best known actually not for his work at Knossos, but for his excavations of the mountain peak sanctuary at Carfi up above the Lasithi plain, which he directed for the school. And subsequently, he had time to put it all together into his well-known book, The Archaeology of Crete. Of course, many things have changed since 1939, particularly in respect of the early parts of that book, but it's still, in other ways, very well worth reading and a treasured possession to have, especially his lists of sites and his surveys that he conducted. He also produced his famous handbook to the Palace of Minos. He remarked that it was difficult for people to carry around the massive tomes of Evans's work, his 4-volume work, his heavy work there, so that a handbook would be useful. And here it is, and still to this day eminently usable on the site. Tragically, for Cretan archaeology, John Pendlebury died only at the age of 36, shot by the Germans at the beginning of the Battle of Crete in Heraklion. He was followed as curator at Knossos by Richard Hutchinson, always known as the Squire, Squire Hutchinson. He didn't really adopt squirearchical manners, but he used to go about the place with his stick at Knossos, and he too excavated an important Tholos tomb as part of the Knossian cemeteries to the north. Immediately after the Second World War and on through the 1950s, the dedicated and exceptionally able Greek local director of antiquities, Dr. Nicholas Platon, had made many careful investigations and repairs and reconstructions in the palace and in the surrounding Minoan buildings, which had necessarily been neglected during the war and during the German occupation. And so British work did not resume until 1956, when Sinclair Hood, director of the BSA since 1954, began his great series of excavations and survey work at Knossos. Sinclair is alive and well at the age of 94. I took this picture only just a few weeks ago. In fact, I gather he was in the museum yesterday with his daughter Dictina here. So this was Sinclair Hood then. It's worth reflecting that when he began in 1956 at Knossos, going right through to today, that represents half the entire period of Minoan archaeology since the first work certainly since the first work of Evans at Knossos. So in some ways our subject is a young one, but it's still wonderful that we can work, and Gerald Cadogan has worked in great collaboration with Sinclair Hood. So he's alive and well at 94, as too is his wife Rachel, his helpmeet in all this work. We should never forget the role. Some of us have been lucky, some of us males, the way in which our wives have contributed hugely to the success of these operations in all sorts of ways over the years. Sinclair's had 2 unofficial students. Present speaker is one of them, and the last speaker today is the other one, the last speaker in today's programme, Gerald Cadogan. His reasons for his excavation work at Knossos were, in a sense, a bit unlike those of Evans and Kalokerinos. They were really quite modest. He said he wanted to check Evans's stratigraphical studies, his stratigraphical work, and his Minoan sequence. He hoped to show, which indeed he very successfully did, that Evans's sequence was a sound one. He confirmed and amplified it in a whole number of ways. But Sinclair's overall contribution to knowledge of the site has been vastly greater than just that, because second only, in fact, to that of Evans, because of his excavations in buildings and tombs over a very wide area, and in another aspect, which I will touch on shortly. Now, within the broader context of Hood's work, and following up an original discovery by Evans, the next major excavation was that of the then assistant director of the British School. Here is a plan of some of the area where Hood worked, of the central area from a balloon photograph with the palace on the right, and you'll notice a building across from the palace on the left-hand side, a square building, the Graphical Museum, where all the finds which aren't precious enough to go into the museum in Heraklion are kept and stored still today. And that's our working home for many of us for many years at Knossos. Well, Mervyn Popham decided to follow up this original discovery of Evans, and he conducted some excavations. I don't know which is the pointer on here. Is one of these a pointer? Oh, there it is. Some excavations exactly there, beside the little palace. So keep in mind that building, because we'll see a close-up of it in a moment. Here is Mervyn Popham. He died in 2000, 11 years ago, an irreplaceable friend and colleague of most of the speakers here today. And he came to his work with a highly knowledgeable base in the archaeology of Cyprus. At Knossos, he published fundamental works on the pottery from the final destruction of the palace site. And we can discuss later the dates of that event if anyone wishes to. In excavation, he uncovered the building to which I've just pointed. It was Evans's so-called Unexplored Mansion. Evans found the edge of it, the little palace, and it stood beside it. And this turned out to be a superbly constructed building. The little palace is at the top of this picture, and in front of it was what Mervyn Popham revealed as the Unexplored Mansion. And it contributed greatly to our knowledge of Knossos because it contained a whole series of destruction deposits from the period we call Late Minoan II, about 1390 BC, arranged throughout this building. And that is usually taken to be the beginning of the period of Mycenaean control, Mycenaean rulers in power at Knossos. It also helped to solve a long-standing dispute, which Hood himself had largely solved a little earlier in his own work, namely that this was a discrete period in Knossian history, the late Minoan II period, following upon the huge destruction of the entire Minoan civilization in the period about some 40 or 50 years before that period, which is, in the ceramic terminology, late Minoan 1b. Now, thus far, we've concentrated on the revelation of Bronze Age Knossos, the Minoan civilization. What about before and after? The great deposits of the Neolithic period, some 7 meters deep under the Minoan palace and accumulated over some 4,000 years, from about 7,000 to about 3,000 BC, were first investigated by Evans himself and published later by Audrey Furness in 1953. And then, to a high scientific standard, by his namesake, but no relation, Professor John Evans in 1958 to 60, and again in 1969 to 70. John died this year, and his work, partly published in full by him, is being brought to full fruition by Peter Tompkins, who will speak to us today, and his colleagues. After the Bronze Age, that is the time of Greek, Roman, Byzantine and Arab Knossos, what about that? While the Greco-Roman city was well known from ancient authors, coins and a few inscriptions, and a few upstanding remnants, excavations to bring out the physical form of the city had been relatively slight. You will hear from Ken Wardle about Roman Knossos later, though one must highlight the 1930s work in the so-called Villa Dionysus, with its superb mosaics, and the Roman buildings above the Unexplored Mansion. The Roman buildings overlay all this mansion here, which were excavated under the direction of Hugh Sackett in 1967 and in 1971, and published by Hugh and his colleagues in a magisterial 2-volume work, fundamental for Cretan Roman studies and the archaeology of Roman Crete, in 1992. Sets the standard for anyone publishing about that period in terms of Cretan archaeology. Here's Hugh, who's alive and well. He teaches classics at Groton School in the United States, well into his 80s, but he still teaches classics at Groton, I'm delighted to say. But here he is, I suspect, at Palekastro, the site he's been involved with in eastern Crete for many years. For the preceding, that is preceding the Greek and the Roman period, the preceding Iron Age and the Greek city, we have knowledge largely, but not entirely, from tombs. These lie in a large area of several cemeteries, just over 1 kilometre to the north of the palace site. Excavations of these Iron Age tombs took place in 1933 and 1935 and were published by James Brock in an exemplary volume in 1951. And then again, further excavations in 1967 and 1943 by Professor Platone, and then in 1975 to 6 and 1980 by the British School, and finally, in the largest ever operation of the BSA, as distinct from Evans's operations, which are not part of the school's work, but the largest ever operation of the school at Knossos, that is, on the adjacent medical faculty site of what was becoming the University of Crete in 1978. That is, half a mile or so to the north of the palace. And that was done, we should note, at the specific invitation of the Greek archaeological authorities in Heraklion. And so the school was responsible for the excavation of 310 tombs from the early Iron Age. And this latter work was under the overall direction of the then director of the school, Dr. Hector Catling. And Hector, I should add, also directed important Bronze Age excavations in the Knossos Valley during his time as director of the school. This great cemetery was supervised by many school students and officers on the ground, notably the then curator, Dr. Jill Carrington-Smith, and the school's extraordinarily able and skilled field architect, the late David Smythe. This huge operation was published by the school in 4 great volumes in 1996, a collaborative achievement under the editorship of Hector Catling and Nicholas Coldstream. Now, this brings us to Nicholas. Renowned for his numerous publications on the Greek Iron Age, a large number of them on tomb and settlement material from Knossos itself, and for his work on contemporary Cypriot material. Nicholas, who died in 2008, approached his work, rightly in my view, in the tradition of the grand narrative, the historical narrative, with a richly based emphasis on artistic and stylistic judgment. During Sinclair Hood's excavations, he had worked on the very scrappy remnants of the Greek sanctuary of Demeter on the Gypsarthis Hill, just to the south of the palace, and this was published by him in another fine volume in 1973. There is still much to learn of the Greco-Roman city, and we shall hear about some of it later on. But the Knossian contribution to early Greek ceramic art and to Roman mosaic work, Villa Dionysus, are of the very best. For the subsequent Byzantine period, moving still northwards geographically, north of the palace site, up in the direction of Heraklion, we have the excavations and plans of 1 or 2 basilican churches, 1 or 2 Byzantine basilican churches. And for the subsequent period of the Arab conquest, from 827 to 961, we have a small stone hut down by the river Kairos stream, in the destruction level of which there were 9 Arab coins. Now, this brief introduction cannot cover all the excavations at Knossos. There have been many, many rescue excavations by the Greek authorities in tombs and in different parts on building plots in the city. Others from the school, notably Gerald Cadogan and Eleni Hadsaki and Richard Hutchinson and George Huxley and others indeed, John Boardman, and by Colin MacDonald, who will speak to us, have carried out such excavations at the site. I myself have had the privilege of excavating Bronze Age Knossos and the Greco-Roman period settlement remains in one or two different parts of the city. And on a just purely very brief personal note, I've been lucky enough to uncover a fair amount of very interesting material, including the bones of seemingly sacrificed Minoan children. The final aspect I would like to touch on is survey, the exploration and documentation of the hundreds of sites in the Knossos Valley. You will hear later of the latest large-scale and hugely productive work when Todd Whitelaw speaks to us about his and the Greek Ephoria's combined operations of the current landscape project. But this work began right at the beginning with Evans and Hogarth. Here is Arthur Evans himself in 1910 at the quarries at Aia Irini, a couple of miles to the south of Knossos, together with the architect Christian Doll. Evans is second from the left. Doll is fourth from the left. Doll had succeeded Fife as the excavation architect at Knossos. Duncan Mackenzie, who is the gentleman in the middle at the back, just behind the two Cretan workmen, and the famous foreman, Manolaki, on the right of the picture. I show this picture really because probably not many of you perhaps not familiar with it, but it shows Evans out and about on the ground, recording sites and taking an interest in sites and making notes on them, subsequently to publish throughout the whole Knossos Valley. Indeed, both Evans and Hogarth published maps of the known sites. This work was hugely expanded by Sinclair Hood. This is the other aspect of Hood's work which I'd like to refer to. The first edition of his Knossos survey, curiously undated, but actually 1958, was followed up by his and David Smythe's second edition of 1981. On this survey, published in this volume by the school, no fewer than 372 numbered sites are to be found in the Knossos Valley, recorded and demonstrated with full bibliography and with maps of the area and the full documentation of those sites. Of course, since 1981, the second edition here, 30 years have passed, and during that time there have been lots of discoveries, and as I've said, Todd Whitelaw will set the position on a wholly new level when he speaks to you. So please let us imagine, during 8,000 years, a landscape teeming with life and indeed with death over this whole region during the Mycenaean, Minoan and Mycenaean periods. The period of the Minoan Palace, about 1950 to about 1930 BC, and during the Greek Iron Age, and indeed in the even larger expansion of occupation of the Roman city. Some notable examples of this teeming you will hear all about in the eagerly awaited papers which follow. But I'd like to finish, if I may, for a minute or so, to offer you perhaps a vision. We'll go back, I hope, to... Here's a splendid view of the palace with Mount Yuktas behind and the whole Knossos Valley. But I will, in fact, go back to finish with this first picture. This is looking at the palace from the east, and you have in the middle ground the green area behind the trees and the village of Knossos just behind the palace, which you can see there. So to finish thus, after all this work throughout 134 or 133 years, how much do we know in terms of material culture? For the period since the Minoan Bronze Age, say 1000 BC to 1000 AD, the answer is really very little. Of what we do know, mostly it's come from inscriptions and coins and texts. But we know from excavations that a whole city existed over the terrain in that period. I say very little in terms of what is upstanding, which can be visited and seen today, apart from the Villa Dionysus with its magnificent mosaics. For the Minoan Bronze Age, say 3000 BC to 1000 BC, we have this great central building, the palace here in the centre, and we have remains of surrounding important buildings which Evans excavated and which can be seen and visited. And we have thousands and thousands of brilliantly made and beautiful artefacts. The palace was overlooked on the south and the west, that is, the top and to the left in this picture, by a city, reached and articulated by carefully built stone-paved roads, measured to a single module all along their lengths. But almost nothing of that is visible today, other than the buildings immediately surrounding the palace. Survey work from Evans and Hogarth and Hood, and now Whitelaw and his team, tell us a very great deal about the spread of occupation over the millennia, and they tell us something about the nature of that occupation. They tell us that there were houses, religious places, quarries, for example. But of its nature, survey is concerned with surface traces. It's by definition, it's not concerned with what is below the surface to any great depth. So let me finish by, if I may, leaving you with a vision, not of the future, but of the past here. Take a look at that hillside just immediately on the other side of the palace, the greenery which you see there on the upper edge of the palace. Popham's excavation of the Unexplored Mansion showed indeed a great mansion made of wonderful ashlar masonry right beside the little palace. The buildings we were lucky enough to find on the other side of the Strata Graphical Museum, reached by a paved road from the palace, also consisted of ashlar masonry buildings in the best style. Just 3 weeks ago today, I was actually standing in the village of Knossos there at one of the building plots, which is currently being investigated by the Greek Archaeological Service before any building can take place. I was actually standing on the bedrock level, which was 5.5 meters below the modern surface of the ground. But I was standing inside a superb Minoan building with walls 90 centimeters wide and parts of 3 rooms uncovered and an exquisite Minoan sealstone just found. That large building was simply one of many, like the Unexplored Mansion and the others I've mentioned, which covered the whole of that hillside in the period of the Minoan Palace, in those centuries in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. So I'd like to finish by asking you to envision that hillside with these superb mansions as to show us just a little of what the Minoans in the palatial period did themselves achieve, and in some ways which forms a climax to this brief introduction. Thank you.